The station had no real name anymore. Travelers called it Dust Shelf because that's what it looked like from the approach lane. A wide, gray ledge hanging in the dark between two dying trade routes, covering the slow accumulation of everything the galaxy had stopped caring about. Old shipping containers welded into storefronts. Vendor stalls draped in fabric that had forgotten its original color. The smell of 36 different biological metabolisms mixing in recycled air that the filtration system was slowly losing its argument with. Marcus Hale had been here for 11 days, and he still hadn't decided if he liked it. He was 34 years old, medium height, the kind of build that came from working with his hands rather than caring about it. His hair was growing out unevenly because he cut it himself 3 months ago with a utility blade and hadn't thought about it since. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, not from anything dramatic, just a fall from a scaffold on a construction job on Meridian Colony when he was 22. He'd bled everywhere, scared the crew half to death, and gone back to work the next morning because the contract didn't cover sick days. He was here because he'd taken a cargo escort job that paid decent and asked no questions. And when the cargo reached Dust Shelf and the employer disappeared without paying the second half, Marcus had found himself with exactly enough credits to eat for 3 weeks and nowhere pressing to be. So he wandered. Dust Shelf's market ran along the station's middle ring, a curved corridor wide enough for 8 people to walk abreast, which meant it was constantly packed with 4 times that many. Beings of shapes and sizes that Marcus had learned not to stare at move between stalls selling food, parts, information, and things that didn't have clean categories. He'd spent his days learning which vendors were honest, which food stalls wouldn't destroy a particular digestive system, and which corners of the market to avoid after the station's lights dimmed to their night cycle. He was doing none of that right now. Right now, he was eating something fried on a stick that the vendor had described using a word his translator rendered as acceptable protein, and watching a child try not to cry. She was sitting between 2 stalls, pressed into the gap like she was trying to make herself smaller than she already was. She was Vaethri. Marcus had learned that word in his first 2 days here, because Vaethri were hard to miss. They stood roughly human height when adult, but their physiology diverged sharply from there. For arms arranged in 2 pairs, the upper set longer and used for reaching and manipulation, the lower set shorter and tucked closer to the body, used for finer work. Their skin ran in patterns, not uniform color, but living striations that shifted with temperature and emotion, the way a mood ring worked, except it was their entire body, and it was biological and involuntary. Calm Vaethri ran in slow blues and greens. Frightened or angry ones flared into sharp golds and reds. This child was a terrible bright orange. She was maybe 6 or 7 by Marcus's rough estimate, though he had no real framework for Vaethri aging. She had all 4 arms wrapped around something he couldn't quite see, and she was sitting in that gap between stalls with the rigid stillness of a small creature that has decided that if it doesn't move, the bad thing won't find it. The bad thing had already found her. 3 of them, adult males by their size, wearing the kind of clothes that communicated we have enough money, to look like we don't care about money. They stood in a loose arc in front of her, not grabbing, not yet, just standing in a way that made the space feel closed. One of them was speaking in low, even tones that Marcus's translator caught fragments of. Belongs to us. Give it back. No one will help you here. Marcus finished his fried thing, set the stick down on the edge of a nearby barrel. He was not a hero. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He had no particular ideology about defending the innocent or standing up to bullies. He was tired. He was underpaid, and he had no stake in whatever this was. But she was maybe 6 years old. She was orange with fear, and there were 3 of them and none of her. He walked over. Hey! All 3 of them turned. Marcus put his hands in his jacket pockets. Not aggressive, not submissive, just present. She okay? He asked. The one in the middle looked at him, the way people look at something that has wandered into a situation it doesn't belong in. His skin striations were a flat, controlled silver, the Vaethri equivalent of a blank expression. Marcus would later learn. Deliberate neutrality. This doesn't involve you, the translator rendered. The original sounds were something between a chord and a breath. Vaethri language operated on harmonic layers a human mouse couldn't replicate. So Marcus had a small device clipped behind his ear that caught the patterns and converted them, imperfectly, into words. Probably not, Marcus agreed. But I'm bored and I'm standing here, so... He looked past him at the girl. Her orange had deepened to something almost red. You okay, kid? She didn't answer. Her lower arms tightened around whatever she was holding. The man on the left moved, not toward Marcus, toward her, and Marcus stepped sideways, putting himself more squarely in the gap, not blocking. Just there, taking up space in a way that made the geometry of reaching past him slightly more complicated. I said, she okay? The middle one made a sound his translator didn't catch, something below the rendering threshold, something meant for Viethri ears that a human device wouldn't parse. But the other two understood it, and the one on the right reached into his coat. Marcus had been in enough bad situations to know the half-second before something happened. It wasn't psychic. It was just pattern recognition built from years of wrong place, wrong time. The shift of weight, the direction of attention, the way the air changed. He moved first. Not well, not elegantly. He got his arm in front of the girl and took the first blade across his forearm, which hurt enormously and bled immediately and was still better than where it had been going. He got his elbow into the face of the one who'd drawn it, heard something crunch, and then the situation became very fast and very painful for about 40 seconds. He remembered the second blade catching him across the ribs, the third and fourth coming from the middle one, who turned out to be faster than he looked, going down on one knee and getting back up because staying down felt worse, catching the fifth across his shoulder, someone in the market screaming, the sixth across his thigh, the seventh he blocked with his forearm again, same arm, same wound, which was a choice he made because the angle meant it was going toward the girl otherwise. The eighth he didn't entirely block. It caught him along the left side of his torso in a way that made breathing suddenly feel like a complicated decision. And then there were people, station security or something that functioned like it, and shouting. And the three men were moving away fast. And Marcus was sitting on the market floor with his back against a stall wall and a spreading warmth across his left side that he knew from experience. He should not look it directly. The girl was still there. She'd moved. She was crouched next to him now, her striations cycling rapidly through colors he didn't have names for yet. All four arms were still wrapped around the thing she'd been holding. He could see it now. A small, carved object, dark material, maybe stone or compressed resin, shaped into an abstract form that meant nothing to him but clearly meant everything to her. The size of his fist. Old from the wear on it. You still got it, he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She looked at him. Her eyes were large and set wider than human eyes, with irises that were a deep, fractured amber. She said something his translator rendered haltingly as, "Why did you do that?" Not a question. More like she was trying to understand a thing that didn't fit her existing categories. "Didn't want them to take your stuff," he said. She stared at him. Then she reached out with one of her lower hands, the smaller, finer ones, and pressed her palm very lightly against the back of his hand. It was brief, barely contact, but her striations went, for just a moment, a color he would later learn was called acknowledgement of a debt that cannot be calculated. Then the market medic arrived, and Marcus stopped paying attention to anything except the instruction to stay conscious. He woke in a medical bay that smelled like antiseptic and something faintly herbal that he didn't recognize. It was a small room, 4 walls, a ceiling with embedded light strips set to low, a bed that had been calibrated for humanoid physiology with what felt like recent adjustment. There was a window, or something functioning as one, a screen showing a live feed of the station's exterior, the slow drift of traffic against the dark. His left side was wrapped tightly and hurt in a dull, managed way that meant painkillers rather than healing. His forearm was bandaged, his shoulder, his thigh. He took a careful inventory of himself and concluded that he was significantly damaged, but probably not in danger, which was a better outcome than he'd been tracking toward. He'd been in bad medical situations before. He knew the particular loneliness of waking up in an unfamiliar place with no one waiting. You assessed yourself. You looked at the ceiling. You waited for a medical professional to appear and tell you what you'd lost. He was prepared for that. He was not prepared for what was actually in the room. There were 6 of them. 6 Viethri, standing, not sitting, standing, in a precise arrangement around his bed, not crowded, not hovering, standing in a way that was clearly deliberate, clearly chosen, with a geometry to their placement that suggested meaning he didn't have the cultural framework to decode. They were not the kind of Viethri he'd seen in the market. Market Viethri wore practical clothes and muted colors, moved in a loose, adaptive way of people navigating crowds. These six wore something that Marcus's brain kept reaching for a military analogy for, and not quite landing on. Not armor. There was no visible armor, but their clothing had a structural quality, a fitted precision, and each of them wore the same dark material with the same minimal markings, and they stood with a stillness that was different from patience. It was a stillness of people who had learned to be still the way other people learned to fight. Their striations were all the same slow, deep indigo. He'd never seen six people wearing the same emotional color before. "Okay," Marcus said. His voice was still rough. "Hi." The one directly at the foot of his bed, slightly forward of the others, which Marcus suspected meant something, looked at him. Her upper arms were folded in a configuration he'd never seen before. Her lower arms were at her sides. She was older, he thought, though he was guessing. There were patterns in her striations that seemed deeper set, more complex than the others. She spoke. His translator took a moment, longer than usual, and rendered, "You are the human who stood between." "Between the guys and the kid, yeah," Marcus said. "Is she okay?" Another pause. The translator worked on the response. "She is well. She has returned to her family. The object she carried is intact." "Good." He shifted slightly against the bed and winced. "So, what's happening here? Are you security? Did I cause some kind of incident?" The six of them exchanged something. Not words, or not words as translator caught. A shift in striations, rapid and synchronized. A conversation happening in color that he was completely outside of. Then the one at the foot of the bed looked back at him, and her translator. She had won, a more sophisticated model than his, built into a collar device, render her words in cleaner, fuller English. "We are Vethrakaln," she said. "There's no direct translation for what we are. You would perhaps say, those who are owed by the deep." Marcus looked at her. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," she said, "that the child you protected is not simply a child, and that what you did has initiated something that neither of us can undo." The room was very quiet. Outside the screen window, a cargo vessel drifted slowly past the station, its running lights blinking in the patient rhythm of a machine that didn't know anything had changed. Her name, the name she permitted him to use, was Selvith. She sat across from him the next morning, when the medic had decided he was stable enough for conversation, in a chair she'd pulled to the side of his bed with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had never needed to rush anything. The other five had withdrawn to the corridor. It was just the two of them, and the low light and the sound of station infrastructure humming behind the walls. She explained slowly, checking his understanding as she went, which he appreciated. The Viethri were not a unified people in the way Marcus had loosely assumed. They had a surface culture, the market people, the traders, the workers of Dust Shelf. And they had what Selvith called the undercurrent, not a secret society, not a government, something older than both. The Viethri had a concept she translated, carefully, as continuity bearers. Every few generations, certain individuals were identified through a combination of lineage, observed disposition, and what she called resonance tests that she didn't fully explain. These individuals were the living carriers of the things of Viethri people couldn't afford to lose. Not objects, not information, but something harder to name. Ways of understanding, patterns of thought. The shape of who they had been before the long dispersal across settled space had stretched them thin. The child, her name was Own, was one of them, identified at age 4, just beginning her education in what she carried. The carved object she'd been holding was not decorative. It was a resonance key, a physical anchor for a specific body of knowledge that existed only in the minds of continuity bearers and the objects that helped them hold it. If you lost the key, you didn't just lose the object. You lost a specific harmonic signature that allowed the knowledge to be passed forward. Selvita's translator struggled here, and she paused several times, searching for the right shape of the idea. It was like, she finally said, If you imagine that a song could only be taught to the next person while the original sheet music was present, not because the music was magic, but because the brain needed external anchor to reconstruct the full complexity of what was carrying. Without it, the transmission was corrupted, incomplete. Owen had been in the market because she was young and curious and had, as young curious beings do, gone somewhere she wasn't supposed to go. The three men who cornered her weren't random thieves. They worked for a collector, a specific kind of collector, Selva said, her indigo striations flickering briefly towards something colder, who had spent years targeting continuity bearers and acquiring their keys, not to use them, to own them, to hold the Viethri's connective tissue in a private vault somewhere as a demonstration of a particular kind of power. Marcus listened to all of this. His side ached. He watched Selva's face as she talked, the way her striations moved with her words, a second language running underneath the first. So what I did, he said slowly when she paused, was protect something that's basically irreplaceable. Yes, and those guys are going to try again. They will be discouraged, Selva said, with a flatness that made Marcus decide not to ask what that meant. So she's safe. Owen is safe. That is not why we are here. Marcus waited. Selva folded her upper hands together. Not the arrangement from yesterday. Something different. Something that felt more deliberate. When a continuity bearer is protected at personal cost, she said, by someone who had no obligation, no knowledge of what they were protecting, no stake in the outcome, the Vethrakon take notice. You didn't know what it was, he said. You just saw a scared child. I just saw a scared child, Marcus confirmed. She looked at him for a long moment. Her striations ran in something he still didn't have a name for. That, she said quietly, is precisely why we are here. He was in the medical bay for 4 days. Selveth came every morning. The others rotated, 2 always in the corridor, the configuration changing. He learned their names. Peth, who was the youngest and whose striations ran warm even at rest. Doran, who said almost nothing but whose attention, when it landed on you, felt like being evaluated by something ancient. Mira and Kale, who moved in the unconscious synchrony of people who worked together for a very long time. And Ren, who laughed at unexpected moments and made the other striations flicker involuntarily in response, like they didn't want but couldn't help it. Marcus was not a man who collected people easily. He'd spent his adult life in the transient economy of contract work. You met people on a job, you liked them or didn't, you moved on. He had a handful of people he'd stayed in touch with, scattered across different stations and colonies, relationships maintained by occasional messages that arrived month apart and said, still alive, you? He wasn't lonely. He'd made a kind of peace with his particular shape of solitude. But 4 days is long enough for things to shift. On the 3rd day, Selveth arrived looking different. Not visibly, not in any way he could have clearly articulated, but her striations were slower. The indigo had a weight to it. He didn't ask. He'd learned, over 3 days, that she would say things when she was ready to say them. They sat in silence for a while. Outside the screen window, a small local transport circled the station in a lazy holding pattern, waiting for a docking slot. I had a daughter, Selva said. Marcus looked at her. She was not a continuity bearer. She was just... The translator hesitated. Ordinary is not the right word. I mean it with full love. She was ordinary in the way that means she was entirely herself, with no weight of the undercurrent on her. She liked building small structures from reclaimed materials. She was very loud at meals. She had a complicated friendship with a being twice her size from a species I had never fully understood, and somehow the two of them communicated in ways neither of their translators could manage, and they didn't care. Marcus didn't say anything. She died 4 years ago. Not violently. An illness that we understood too late. I was not with her. I was on a protection detail for a continuity bearer on the far side of the system, and by the time I received the message and traveled, she stopped. Her striations ran a color he'd never seen before, dark and slow and shot through with something that he felt, physically, as loss. Not as loss, but lost the way a tuning fork feels vibration from across the room. I had committed to the work a long time before she was born. The work does not pause. I knew this. She knew this. We had built our life around the shape of it. But you weren't there, Marcus said. I was not there. The transport outside finally received its docking clearance and moved smoothly toward the station, and they watched it go. When I heard what you did, Selva said, I read the station security logs. I wanted to understand. You were not in a position that made protecting her easy. You did not have weapons. You had no information about what she carried. You simply saw that she was small and frightened and that the geometry of the situation was wrong, and you put your body in the way. Yeah, Marcus said. I have spent 4 years thinking about the different forms that care takes, Selva said. The formal kind, the structured kind, the kind that follows an oath, and the kind that has no origin in duty or philosophy or obligation. Just, the translator reached for it. Reflex of the good. Marcus turned that over. Reflex of the good, he repeated. Our oldest word for it is closer to the motion toward, the thing that moves before thought. We consider it the purest evidence of a being's interior because it cannot be performed. It happens or it does not. He understood then why she'd told him about her daughter, not as context, not as explanation, as the most honest thing she knew how to offer. I'm sorry, he said, about your daughter. Her striations ran that dark, complex color again, and this time he recognized it. Not grief exactly. Grief that had been carried long enough to become something structural, something you build around rather than through. Her name was Olin, Selva said. She would have thought what you did was very dramatic and a little ridiculous. Marcus laughed. It pulled at his stitches. He did it anyway. On the 4th day, all 6 of them came in together. It was not threatening, but it was formal in a way he could feel without fully understanding. They arranged themselves the same way they'd been when he first woke. The specific geometry, the deliberate placement, the shared indigo running steady and synchronized. Selva stood at the foot of his bed again. You will be discharged today, she said. Your injuries are significant, but not permanent. The station medical system has been covered. You didn't need to do that, Marcus said. We do not do things we do not need to do, she said. That is different from saying it was a transaction. He accepted that. There is something we would like to say, she continued. It is not a request. It is not an offer of employment. It is more complicated than either of those. He waited. The Vethra column exists because the undercurrent needs protecting, she said. The continuity bearers carry what we cannot afford to lose. We carry them. That is the work. It requires beings who can move in spaces we cannot, who read situations through different frameworks, who notice different things, who respond different signals. We are not looking for soldiers. We have enough people who know how to fight. What we do not have... She paused. Her striations moved. The others moved in response. Is someone who moves toward, she said, before thought, without calculation. Marcus looked at her, then at the 5 others. Pet's warm striations. Doran's ancient attention. Mira and Kale's synchronized stillness. Ren, who was not laughing now, whose expression was the most serious he'd seen on her. You want me to travel with you, he said. We want to offer you the choice, she said, which is different. We have read your file. We know your history. We know what you are working toward and what you have left behind. We are not pretending this is without cost to you or without danger. What happened to the last person who held that position? A pause. There was no last person, Selva said. We have never asked before. The room was very quiet. Marcus thought about the 11 days on Dust Shelf. He thought about the unpaid contract and the 3 weeks of eating money and the nowhere pressing to be. He thought about the scaffold fall when he was 22, the way he'd gone back to work the next day, not because he was brave, but because staying still felt worse than moving. He thought about a child crouched between 2 market stalls, holding something precious and being very orange with fear. Can I think about it? He asked. Of course, Selva said. Can I ask on something first? A different pause. Longer. Yes, Selva said. They brought her the next morning. After he'd been discharged to a station side room the Vethra column had arranged. It was small and clean and had a real window, actual transparent material, looking out at the exterior, the stars, the slow commerce of the station's traffic. She came in ahead of the adult who'd accompanied her, a tall Vaethri man whose striations were a careful, monitored gold that suggested he was more nervous than he was showing, and stood in the middle of the room and looked at Marcus with those wide amber eyes. He was sitting in the room's single chair with his side still aching, and he'd moved the chair to face the window because the stars were nice and helped him think. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. Her translator was a small clip behind her upper right ear, and it rendered her voice as higher, younger, which of course it would be. She was still carrying the resonance key. He'd been told she would keep it with her until she was old enough to not need the physical anchor years from now. "I wanted to ask you something," Marcus said. She came closer. Not cautious, just careful, the way children are when they're deciding about a person. "When you were in the market," he said, "when those men were there, were you scared?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Were you scared I was going to make it worse?" She considered this with the seriousness only children apply to questions adults expect them to deflect. "Yes," she said again. "You were a stranger. You didn't know what they were saying. I thought maybe you would say the wrong thing, and then there would be more trouble. But I didn't say the wrong thing. You didn't say anything complicated," she said. "You just stood there. It was..." Her translator worked. "It was like when you put a wall between a fire and the wind. The fire is still there, but it cannot spread." Marcus looked at her. "That's a good way to put it," he said. She looked at the carved object in her lower hands. Her striations ran a slow, comfortable blue-green. "Are you going to come with Selveth?" she asked. "Why do you ask?" "Because she asked me if it was all right." Owen said, "She always asks me what I think, even though I am small and the decisions are not mine to make. She says the undercurrent is only worth carrying if the people in it are listened to, even the small ones." She paused. "I told her I thought it was all right. What made you think that?" She looked at him with a direct, uncomplicated evaluation of a child who hasn't yet learned to dress up her observations. "Because you were bleeding and you still asked if I still had it," she said. "Before you asked anything about yourself. People who ask about others before themselves are usually safe." Marcus stayed with that for a moment. "That's a very wise thing to know," he said. She shrugged with her upper arms, a very human gesture that surprised him. "Selveth taught me," she said. "She says you can learn a lot about what someone carries inside them by watching what they notice when they are in pain." He looked out the window at the stars. There was a particular star visible from this angle. He'd been watching it since last night, trying to remember if he knew its designation. He didn't. It was just a star, anonymous and patient, doing what stars do regardless of what was happening in the small, warm, pressurized spaces around it. "Okay," he said. Owen tilted her head. "Okay, what?" "Nothing," he said. "I just decided something." He found Selveth on the station's observation deck that afternoon. She was standing at the full-length transparent panel that formed the outer wall, looking out at the same slow traffic he'd been watching from his window. Her striations ran an even, private color he was starting to recognize as her thinking expression. Something she didn't perform for others, just ran when she was alone with her thoughts. He stood beside her, not too close. There was a comfortable distance, which was something he appreciated about the Vethrakaln. They had, all of them, a native understanding of the different kinds of space between people. "I'll come," he said. She didn't look at him, but her striations moved. "I have conditions," he said. "Tell me." "I'm not a soldier. I know I said that to myself already. But I need it said out loud between us. If this turns into me running combat operations, we have a problem. What I did in the market, that's the outer limit of what I'm capable of and the inner limit of what I'm willing to do. I can read situations. I can put myself in the way. I cannot be the weapons guy." "Understood," she said. "It is not what we want you for. Second, you tell me the truth. Always. If there's something dangerous coming, you tell me in advance. I don't get protected from information. I've gotten hurt worse from surprises and from things I knew were coming." "Yes. Third." He paused. This one was harder to say right. "I'm not replacing anything you lost. I know that's not what you're asking for, but I want to say it out loud, so we both know I know it. Whatever this is, it's its own thing, not a substitute, not a repair." She turned to look at him. Her striations ran that color he'd first seen when she told him about her daughter. The deep, Structural grief becomes something else color. Yes, she said. The same is true in reverse. You should know. We will not pretend that this is easy or without weight, or that we are not asking for something significant. We lost someone, too, before we were Vethricon. All of us lost something. The work takes. We know what we are asking when we ask for more of you. What did you lose? He asked. She looked back at the stars. Duran lost the station where he grew up. Not dramatically. It was decommissioned, evacuated, dismantled for parts over the course of a decade. He watched the pieces sold off from a distance, one by one. Peth lost her resonance key when she was young. She was a continuity bearer, before she became Vethricon. The knowledge she carried is partially gone now. She carries the missing shape of it. Mira and Kale lost each other for 11 years to a misunderstanding that took most of that time to even identify. Ren, she paused. Ren lost her faith in the undercurrent. She was gone from us for 6 years. She came back. We do not ask her about the 6 years. And you lost Olin, Marcus said. And I lost Olin. They stood together for a while. The station's traffic moved in its patient orbits. Somewhere in the structure below them, Marcus could feel the low vibration of the station's core systems, the heartbeat of a place too complicated to fully understand from the inside. There's one more thing, he said. Tell me. If Owen ever wants to talk to me, anytime, about anything, I'm available, even if it's inconvenient, even if we're in the middle of something. She gets to reach out. Selvith looked at him. Her striations moved in the color. He now knew was called acknowledgement of a debt that cannot be calculated. The same color the child had shown him on the market floor, with a small hand pressed briefly to the back of his. That condition, Selvith said quietly, was never in question. They left Dust Shelf on the 5th day after his discharge. The Vethricon ship was called Setholinvar, which translated approximately as the one that keeps watch in the dark, and it was smaller than Marcus expected. Built for the kind of travel that needed to be quiet, unremarkable, hard to remember. It looked, from the outside, like 100 other mid-range transports moving through the station's traffic. Inside it was different. Efficient, considered, every centimeter used with purpose. It had been adapted and readapted over years until it fit the specific shape of the people who lived in it. They showed him the bunk they prepared, second from the end in the sleeping corridor, with a small storage unit and a clear panel in the ceiling that showed the exterior when the ship was moving. For watching stars, Peth said. Her warm striations flashed briefly. He set his bag down. It was a small bag. He'd always traveled light. Before they departed, Marcus went back to the market. He stood in the gap between the two stalls where he'd found Owen and looked at the scuffed floor. The market moved around him, unhurried, already finished with the event. 3 days past was practically ancient history in a place where hundreds of beings moved through every hour. He was trying to understand something. He'd spent 11 days on Dust Shelf and hadn't been able to decide if he liked it. He'd arrived indifferent and left changed. And the change had happened not through a decision or a plan, but through a moment of 40 seconds, and a child who noticed that he'd asked about her before himself. He was not a philosophical person. He didn't think much about the architecture of cause and effect, the way one moment builds the next. He had friends who were like that, who could trace the shape of their lives and say it was this is where it turned. He usually couldn't. Things happened, and he moved forward, and the direction of forward was usually whatever had the least resistance. But standing in the gap between the stalls, he could see it clearly, not the heroism of it. There was no heroism in it. He'd just been present, and then the situation had happened around him. But the meaning of it, the way a moment of unremarkable care could become, to someone watching, a window into something they needed to see. Selvith had needed to see that the reflex of the good existed in something outside her order. Owen had needed to see that strangers could be walls between fire and wind. And Marcus had needed to see that sometimes what you carry matters, even when you don't know you're carrying it. He walked back through the market, past the acceptable protein vendor, past the stalls draped in faded fabric. He bought something for the journey. Nothing important, just food that his translator confirmed wouldn't disagree with him. On the ship's ramp, Ren was waiting. Her striations were doing the thing where they moved toward a laugh she wasn't quite releasing. You ready? She said. He thought about Selvita's daughter, whose name was Olin, who was loud at meals and built small structures from reclaimed materials. He thought about Peth, who carried the shape of a missing piece of herself and had still made him a window for watching stars. He thought about Own, somewhere below in the station, holding a carved object that was also a way of keeping the past alive in the present. He thought about the 8 blades and the fact that he'd taken them all for someone he hadn't known and hadn't needed to know. He thought, there are worse reasons to go somewhere. Yeah, he said, I'm ready. The ramp closed behind them. Seth Olinvar, the one that keeps watch in the dark, pulled away from Dust Shelf Station and moved into the patient dark. And the stars were everywhere, and Marcus lay in his bunk and looked up to the clear panel, all of them, uncountable and indifferent and somehow, tonight, not lonely at all.